All right, so you know how sometimes you hear a news story and you just think, wait, what?
Yeah.
That was me when I heard about thousands of federal employees, getting their jobs back after being fired, like thousands of them.
It definitely seems like something worth digging into.
Yeah, and, everyone's busy, so we're going to cut right to the chase today and really understand what's going on here.
Okay.
So in this deep dive, we're talking about the rehiring of almost 25,000 federal workers who were let go earlier.
Right.
And what's really interesting is this whole thing involves the Trump administration.
Uh-huh.
And, this initiative that our source calls Elon Musk's Department of Governmental Efficiency.
Okay.
And our source, by the way, is a YouTube transcript of Glenn Kirshner talking about a BBC News report.
Gotcha.
And they even sometimes jokingly called this department DOGE.
Interesting.
So what we really want to do is understand why these people were fired in the first place.
Right.
Why courts said those firings were actually illegal. How many people were actually affected. And what does this mean for taxpayers in terms of costs?
All good questions.
Yeah, so no political spin here. We're just looking at the facts.
Okay.
So first things first, how did these firings even happen?
Well, according to the reports, it looks like the Trump administration wanted to, make the federal workforce more efficient.
Uh-huh. And Elon Musk and his Department of Governmental Efficiency were apparently involved in this.
Yep.
I mean, it's not totally clear how official this department actually was, but the source says it was meant to help reduce the number of federal employees.
I see.
And what's important is that they weren't firing longtime government workers.
Right.
These were people who had been recently hired and were still on probation.
I see.
So maybe they thought this would be easier, legally speaking, to reduce the size of the government.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But that strategy didn't really work out because they ended up facing legal challenges.
Yeah.
And this is where things get really interesting. Two federal judges, James Bredar in Maryland and William Alsup in California, they both looked at the situation and said, nope, these mass layoffs were illegal.
Wow. So two separate judges agreed on that.
Yeah, and that's a pretty serious statement from the courts.
Absolutely. It means there were some pretty fundamental legal problems with how they fired all these people.
Exactly. And because of that, they ordered these workers to be rehired while further legal stuff is sorted out.
Well,
and this is why we're seeing all this rehiring happening now.
So what exactly were the legal issues with the firings?
Well, we'll get into that a little bit later, but first, let's talk about just how many people were affected by this.
Okay.
The BBC report said nearly 25,000 people lost their jobs.
Wow.
To give you an idea of just how big that number is, they broke it down by some of the departments.
Yeah.
The Treasury Department had a whopping 7,600 positions cut.
Wow.
Then the Department of Agriculture with 5,700.
That's a lot.
And the Department of Health and Human Services lost over 3,200 people.
It's crazy how many people were affected.
Right. And hundreds more across tons of other departments and agencies.
So are they trying to rehire all these people now?
Yeah. The report said that 18 different federal departments and agencies had to send documents to a federal court in Baltimore explaining how they were going to rehire all these folks.
18 departments and agencies.
Yeah. Can you imagine the logistics of rehiring that many people across so many different parts of the government?
It's mind-boggling.
But beyond the logistics, there's a bigger issue here.
And that is?
Money.
Yes, the financial implication.
Exactly. The YouTube transcript we're looking at really focuses on this.
It's a huge factor whenever we talk about the government and how they spend taxpayer dollars.
Right. And it's likely going to cost a lot of money to fix this whole mess.
Yeah. How so?
Well, think about it. These employees weren't working because they were fired illegally.
Yeah.
And now the courts are saying they have to get their jobs back.
Right.
So what happens to the time they were out of work?
Yeah.
They have to be paid for that time? That's back pay. And the YouTube commentary points out that all this money is coming from taxpayers.
So essentially, we're paying for a mistake the government made.
That's essentially it. And the commentator also brought up this interesting point.
What's that?
They said that someone like Elon Musk, who's, incredibly wealthy, might not be too worried about the cost to taxpayers.
Yeah, but for the average person, this is a pretty big deal.
Absolutely. It's our money that's going towards fixing this.
What do you think is the biggest takeaway from this whole financial aspect?
I think it shows that people outside the government might not always understand or care about the impact their actions have on taxpayers.
That's a good point. It raises questions about, how carefully they thought this through before they fired all those people.
Yeah, and it's not like this was the only time something like this happened.
Really?
The BBC report mentioned another case where a judge stopped the Trump administration from shutting down USAI.
So it seems like this wasn't just a one-off thing.
Yeah, it looks like there were a lot of legal challenges to things the Trump administration was trying to do.
Interesting.
And the courts were basically stepping in and saying, hold on, you can't do that.
So the courts were like a safeguard against overreach.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about legal arguments either.
What do you mean?
This whole situation had real consequences for real people.
Yeah, those 25,000 people who lost their jobs.
Exactly. And now taxpayers have to foot the bill for the government's mistake.
Right. It goes beyond just legal theory. It
Yeah.
becomes a real life issue.
So let's sum this up for our listener.
Okay.
We've been talking about how almost 25,000 federal workers were fired, and courts have now said those firings were illegal.
And that those workers have to be rehired.
Right. And this all started with the Trump administration and something called Elon Musk's Department of Governmental Efficiency.
And DOGE.
Huge.
And now taxpayers will likely have to pay for all the back pay owed to those workers.
Exactly. It's a big mess, and it really makes you think about how our government works. Well, the court stepped in and said the firings were wrong, which shows that they have a really important role in making sure the executive branch doesn't overstep